The rain hammered against the tall windows of the mansion as Richard stepped out of his black car. His driver quickly opened an umbrella, but Richard barely noticed. His mind was already racing through tomorrow's meetings, the quarterly reports, the next big deal that could add another million to his already overflowing bank account. He'd built his empire from nothing. 20 years ago, he was just another kid with a laptop and a dream, coding in his tiny apartment, living on instant noodles and black coffee. Now he owned a technology company that supplied software to half the Fortune 500 companies in the country. His house alone was worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. But success, as Richard had learned, always came with a price tag that money couldn't cover. Inside the marble foyer, the silence wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The chandelier above sparkled with 1,000 crystals, each one probably worth more than a decent car. His footsteps echoed as he walked across the polished floor. Everything in this house was expensive, carefully chosen, perfectly arranged. Everything except happiness. Richard loosened his tie and headed toward his office on the first floor. He had reports to review before the morning video conference with the Tokyo office. Sleep could wait. It usually did. As he passed the grand staircase, he paused for just a moment, looking up toward the second floor where his daughter's room was located. The light was off. She was probably already asleep. He checked his watch. 8:30. Yes, definitely asleep. Her bedtime was 8 o'clock sharp, according to the schedule he'd approved. His daughter Lily was 8 years old now. 8 years that had passed in a blur of medical appointments, therapy sessions, specialist consultations, and an ever-rotating door of caregivers and nurses. She'd been born with cerebral palsy, and while her mind was sharp and bright, her body didn't always cooperate the way she wanted it to. She used a wheelchair to get around and needed help with most daily tasks. Richard had made sure she had everything. The best doctors, the most advanced wheelchair money could buy. A room specially designed for accessibility. Every therapy and treatment that showed even a hint of promise. He'd even had an elevator installed so she could move between floors easily. No expense was too great for his little girl. But somewhere along the way, in all his efforts to give her the best care possible, he'd forgotten something important. He just couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. 2 years ago, his wife, Catherine, had left. She'd packed her bags one Tuesday morning while he was at work, and Lily was at a therapy appointment. By the time he came home, there was just a note on the kitchen counter. She wrote that she couldn't handle it anymore. The constant worry, the medical emergencies, the way their daughter's condition had taken over their entire lives. She needed to find herself again, she wrote. She needed space to breathe. Richard had read the note 3 times, standing in the kitchen with his briefcase still in his hand, trying to process the words. Then he'd folded it neatly, put it in his desk drawer, and never spoke of it again. Catherine sent birthday cards to Lily twice a year, and deposited money into an account Richard had set up for her, though they both knew she didn't need it. She'd remarried within a year, to an artist she'd met at some gallery opening. Richard had seen the announcement on social media, though he'd never admit to looking. After Catherine left, the house got quieter. Lily, who had always been a bit reserved, became even more withdrawn. She'd stopped asking when Mommy would come home after the first few months. Now she barely spoke at all, even during her lessons with her tutor or sessions with her physical therapist. Richard dealt with it the only way he knew how. He worked more. He hired the best caregivers. He bought things. A new computer with special accessibility features. Books, toys, games, anything that might bring a smile to his daughter's face. But the smiles, when they came at all, never quite reached her eyes. The caregivers came and went. Some stayed for months, others for just weeks. They were all qualified, professional, efficient. They followed the schedules Richard created, administered the medications on time, took Lily to her appointments, prepared her meals according to the nutritionist's guidelines. They did everything right by the book, but something was always missing. Richard couldn't quite name it, but he felt it every time he came home to this big, quiet house. The most recent caregiver, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, had quit just 3 weeks ago. She'd given her 2 weeks' notice, citing philosophical differences in care approach, which Richard suspected was professional language for, "Your expectations are exhausting." She'd recommended a replacement, someone from the same agency, another credential-heavy professional with years of experience. But that candidate had accepted another position before Richard could finalize the offer. So he'd gone to a different agency, a smaller one that his assistant had found. They'd sent over several candidates, and Richard had interviewed them all in his office during lunch breaks, asking the same questions, checking the same qualifications. Most of them seemed uncomfortable in the mansion. They'd sit in the leather chairs across from his desk, eyes wandering to the expensive art on the walls, clearly calculating whether they were good enough for this environment. Richard didn't care about that. He cared about competence, reliability, and whether they could follow instructions. Then he'd met Rosa. She was different from the others, though at first he couldn't quite say how. She was in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, and hands that showed years of hard work. She wore a clean but inexpensive dress and carried a worn purse. When she sat down across from him, she didn't gawk at the office or seem intimidated by the surroundings. She simply folded her hands in her lap and waited. Her resume was modest compared to the others. She'd worked as a caregiver for elderly patients, had done some child care, had taken a few certification courses. Nothing spectacular, but when he asked her why she wanted the position, she'd looked him straight in the eye and said something that stuck with him. "I need the work, sir," she'd said honestly. "I'm supporting my sister's children back home and the pay you're offering would help a lot. But more than that, I'm good at taking care of people. Not just their bodies, but their hearts too. Children need that, especially children who are struggling." Richard had appreciated the honesty about needing the job. Too many candidates pretended it was all about passion and calling when really it was about the paycheck. At least Rosa was upfront, and she had good references from her previous employers, all of them praising her warmth and dedication. He'd hired her on a trial basis. Starting 3 weeks ago, the first day, he'd given her a complete tour of the house, showed her Lily's room, explained all the equipment, handed her a thick binder with schedules, emergency contacts, dietary restrictions, therapy routines, and medication information. Rosa had listened carefully, taking notes in a small notebook, asking practical questions about where things were kept and what Lily liked to eat. Then he'd introduced her to Lily. His daughter had been in her wheelchair by the window, looking out at the garden with that distant expression she wore so often. When Richard brought Rosa into the room, Lily had turned her head slowly and studied the new caregiver with cautious eyes. "Lily, this is Rosa," Richard had said. "She's going to be taking care of you for a while." "Rosa, this is my daughter Lily." Rosa had walked over and knelt down beside the wheelchair, getting to eye level with the little girl. "Hello, Lily," she'd said softly. "I'm very happy to meet you. You have such a beautiful room." Lily had just stared at her, not responding. After years of new caregivers coming through like a revolving door, she'd learned not to get attached. Richard had cleared his throat. "Lily doesn't talk much," he'd explained, "but she understands everything. She's very smart. Top marks with her tutor." Rosa had nodded but kept her attention on Lily. "I bet you are smart," she'd said. "I can see it in your eyes. We're going to be friends, you and me. I think so anyway." Lily had looked away then, back toward the window. Rosa had stood up, not seeming bothered by the lack of response. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Richard had barely seen Rosa except in passing. She arrived at 7 in the morning before he left for work. She stayed until 6 in the evening when the night nurse took over. On the weekends, she came for half days, and Richard usually spent that time in his office anyway, working on projects that never seemed to end. He'd asked his assistant to check in on things, to make sure everything was running smoothly. The reports came back positive. Lily was eating well, sleeping well, attending all her appointments on time. Rosa was punctual, professional, followed all the guidelines. Everything was fine, efficient, running like clockwork. Just the way Richard liked it, so why did the house still feel so empty? Richard shook his head, pulling himself out of his thoughts. He had work to do. The Tokyo meeting wouldn't run itself. He headed into his office and closed the door behind him, shutting out the silence of the house. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming against the windows of the big, quiet mansion where 2 people lived but barely existed together. Upstairs in her room, a little girl lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for something she couldn't name. And in the smaller bedroom down the hall, a caregiver sat on her bed, looking at a photograph of children far away, wondering if what she was doing here was making any difference at all. None of them knew that everything was about to change. That in just a few days, a moment of unexpected joy would crack open the walls Richard had built around his heart. That laughter, something so simple and so rare in this house, would break through the silence and force a father to see what he'd been missing all along. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. For now, the house remained quiet, wrapped in its routine, everyone playing their assigned roles, keeping their distance, protecting themselves from disappointment. The rain fell harder, washing against the windows like tears. The house was crying for all the happiness that should have been inside it, but somehow never was. 3 weeks had passed since Rosa started working in the mansion, and Richard had fallen back into his comfortable routine of avoidance. He left early, came home late, and communicated with Rosa through sticky notes left on the kitchen counter and brief text messages about schedule changes. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, Richard sat in a conference room on the 20th floor of his downtown office building, listening to his marketing team pitch ideas for their next product launch. The presentation was boring, filled with charts and buzzwords that meant nothing. His mind wandered, thinking about the contract negotiations in Singapore next month, the board meeting on Friday, anything but the drone of voices around him. Then his phone buzzed. It was his assistant, Jennifer. The message was brief. Client meeting canceled. Anderson had a family emergency. You're free for the rest of the day. Richard stared at the message. Free? He couldn't remember the last time he'd had an unexpected free afternoon. His calendar was usually packed months in advance, every hour accounted for, every minute scheduled. He looked around the conference room at the marketing team, still talking about demographics and market penetration rates. Without a word, he stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out. His team looked confused, but his second-in-command quickly took over, used to Richard's occasional abrupt exits. Going home, Richard said to Jennifer as he passed her desk. She looked up, surprised, her fingers frozen over her keyboard. Home, but you have the budget review at 4 and the call with the investors at 5:30. Reschedule them, Richard said, not breaking his stride toward the elevator. He didn't know why he was doing this. Maybe it was the gray sky outside threatening another storm. Maybe it was the way that conference room suddenly felt suffocating. Or maybe it was the small voice in the back of his head that had been getting louder lately, whispering that he was missing something important. The drive home took 30 minutes through afternoon traffic. His driver, Peter, kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, clearly puzzled by the early departure but knew better than to ask questions. Richard stared out the window, watching the city give way to suburbs, then to the gated community where his mansion stood behind high walls and manicured hedges. When they pulled into the circular driveway, Richard noticed Rosa's old car parked by the side entrance. It was a beat-up sedan, probably 15 years old, with a dent in the bumper and paint fading from years in the sun. It looked out of place next to his collection of luxury vehicles in the garage, but he'd told her she could park there. The walk from the street was long, especially in bad weather. Richard let himself in through the front door, loosening his tie as he stepped into the foyer. The house was quiet as always. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, the only sound breaking the silence. He set his briefcase down by the door, something he never did. Usually he took it straight to his office. He stood there for a moment listening. Nothing, just the clock and the faint hum of the air conditioning. He checked his watch. 3:15. Lily would be done with her afternoon rest time. Rosa usually helped her with some activities around this time according to the schedule. Reading maybe, or educational games on the computer. Richard started toward the stairs thinking he might check in on them. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually spent time with Lily on a weekday afternoon. Weekends, he sometimes sat with her during breakfast, though he usually had his laptop open, half his attention on emails. But a Wednesday afternoon? This was new territory. He reached the bottom of the staircase and put his foot on the first step. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought he was imagining things. He stopped, one hand on the banister, listening harder. There it was again. A sound so unexpected, so out of place in this quiet house that it made his heart skip a beat. Laughter. Not just any laughter. A child's laughter. Light and genuine and full of pure joy. The kind of sound that most parents probably heard every day, but that Richard couldn't remember hearing in his own home for longer than he cared to admit his daughter's laughter. Richard stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his hand gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt something twist in his chest, a painful mixture of happiness and grief. When was the last time he'd heard Lily laugh like that? Really laugh. Not the polite chuckle she sometimes gave when her tutor tried too hard to be funny, but genuine, uncontrolled laughter. He couldn't remember. And that realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The laughter came again, floating down from the second floor, accompanied by music. Something upbeat and cheerful with a rhythm that made you want to move. Richard started climbing the stairs slowly, quietly, drawn toward the sound like it was a lifeline and he was drowning. As he climbed higher, he could hear more. Rosa's voice singing softly in Spanish, words he didn't understand but that sounded warm and full of life. More giggles from Lily. The music continued, some kind of Latin pop song that was completely unlike the classical music or educational recordings that usually played in his daughter's room. Richard reached the top of the stairs and moved down the hallway toward Lily's room. The door was open, and late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything in gold. He approached slowly, carefully, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell had created this moment. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. What he saw made him forget to breathe. Rosa had Lily out of her wheelchair. The chair sat empty by the window, and Rosa was supporting his daughter in her arms, Lily's feet barely touching the ground. Rosa held her securely, one arm around her waist, the other holding Lily's hand up like they were in a formal dance. And they were moving, gently swaying to the music, Rosa taking tiny steps and supporting Lily through the movements. Lily's head was thrown back slightly. Her face lit up with the biggest smile Richard had ever seen. Her eyes sparkled with joy. As Rosa turned them in a slow circle, still singing softly, Lily laughed again, that beautiful, pure sound that shattered something inside Richard's chest. 1, 2, 3, Rosa counted in Spanish, her voice musical. 1, 2, 3. That's it, pequeña. You're dancing. You're a beautiful dancer. Lily's words came out a bit slurred, as they often did, but they were clear enough. I'm dancing, she said, wonder in her voice. Rosa, I'm really dancing. Yes, you are, Rosa said, spinning them both slowly. You're the best dancer I know. Richard stood in the doorway, completely frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but watch this impossible scene unfold before him. Tears blurred his vision, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He just stood there, watching his daughter experience joy in a way he'd thought she never could. All those years, all those therapies, all those specialists and expensive treatments and carefully controlled exercises, none of them had ever made her look like this. None of them had brought out this smile, this laughter, this pure happiness, and here was Rosa, this woman he'd hired just 3 weeks ago, this caregiver with the modest resume and the old car, creating magic in his daughter's room with nothing but music and kindness. The song changed to another upbeat track, and Rosa noticed Lily getting a bit tired. Okay, mi amor, she said gently. One more spin and then we rest, yes? One more, Lily agreed, still smiling. Rosa did one final gentle turn with her, then slowly, carefully helped Lily back into her wheelchair. She was so gentle, so attentive, making sure Lily was comfortable and secure, but instead of strapping her in right away like the previous caregivers always did, Rosa knelt down beside the chair and brushed Lily's hair back from her face. You did so good, Rosa said softly. You're such a strong girl. Did you have fun? Lily nodded enthusiastically. Can we dance again tomorrow? Every day if you want to, Rosa promised. Every single day. That's when Richard's phone rang. He'd forgotten to silence it. The loud ringtone shattered the moment like glass breaking. Both Rosa and Lily's heads snapped toward the doorway where Richard stood. Rosa's face went pale. She scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over the wheelchair in her rush. Mr. Thornton, she gasped. I didn't know you were home. I'm sorry, I should have heard you come in. Richard quickly silenced his phone without even looking at who was calling. He stepped into the room and Rosa took an unconscious step back. Her hands were shaking slightly and Richard could see panic in her eyes. She thought she was in trouble. She thought he was going to fire her. Lily, Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. He cleared his throat and tried again. Hi, sweetheart. His daughter's smile had faded the moment she saw him. She looked nervous now, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. Hi, Daddy, she said quietly. I didn't know you were coming home early. "I finished work early today," Richard said. He couldn't stop looking at her face, at the lingering flush in her cheeks from the dancing, at the way her eyes still held a sparkle that hadn't been there this morning at breakfast. Rosa was backing toward the door, clearly planning to make an escape. "I'll just go and start preparing dinner," she said quickly. "I'm sorry if we were too loud. We should have been quieter. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." "Wait," Richard said. The word came out sharper than he intended and Rosa froze. He took a breath, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to figure out what to say when his entire world had just shifted on its axis. He looked at Rosa, really looked at her. She was breathing fast, her hands clasped tightly together, waiting for him to yell at her or worse. Her eyes darted to Lily, protective even in her fear, like she was already worried about how his anger might affect the little girl. Then he looked at his daughter, who sat quietly in her wheelchair. All the joy drained from her face, replaced with that careful blankness she usually wore. The smile was gone. The sparkle was fading. In just a minute, she'd gone from the happiest child in the world to a scared little girl waiting for her father's judgment. And Richard realized something that made him feel sick to his stomach. His daughter was afraid of disappointing him. His presence in this room had killed her joy as effectively as flipping a light switch. When had that happened? When had he become someone whose arrival meant the end of happiness? "Don't apologize," Richard finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. "Please don't apologize." Rosa looked confused. "Sir?" Richard walked further into the room, his expensive shoes soundless on the plush carpet. He pulled up the small desk chair and sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. He felt like he'd been running for years and had just now stopped long enough to realize how tired he was. "The music," he said. "Don't turn it off. And the dancing." He looked at Lily, at his beautiful daughter who was watching him with cautious eyes. "I want you to keep doing it. Every day. As much as you want." Lily's eyebrows went up slightly. "Really?" "Really," Richard said. He tried to smile, but his face felt stiff, unpracticed at the expression. "I heard you laughing." From downstairs. "It was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." Something flickered in Lily's expression. Not quite a smile, but something close. A tiny crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Rosa was still standing by the door, looking uncertain. Richard turned to her. "Could you stay for a moment?" he asked. "I'd like to talk to you. Both of you, actually." Rosa nodded slowly and came back into the room, though she stayed standing, her hands still clasped nervously in front of her. Richard looked at his daughter, at this little girl who he'd tried so hard to help, but who he'd somehow failed in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Lily," he said, "did you have fun? Dancing with Rosa?" Lily glanced at Rosa, then back at her father. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said quietly. "Good," Richard said. "That's good. I'm glad." He paused, searching for words that had never come easily to him. Business negotiations, yes. Complex contracts, no problem. But talking to his own daughter about feelings, that was harder than anything else he'd ever done. "I want you to be happy," he finally said. "That's all I've ever wanted. I know I don't always show it the right way. I know I'm not around enough. But seeing you smile like that just now, hearing you laugh, that's what matters. Not the schedules or the routines or any of the other stuff. Just you being happy." Lily didn't say anything, but her grip on the wheelchair armrests loosened slightly. Richard turned to Rosa, who was watching him with those keen eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable with. "I need to talk to you," he said. "About Lily, about what you did just now. About a lot of things, actually." Rosa nodded. "Of course, Mr. Thornton. Could we talk in my study? After dinner, maybe?" He looked at Lily. "You okay here for a bit, sweetheart?" Lily nodded, and Richard stood up from the chair. As he turned to leave, he heard Lily's voice behind him, soft and tentative. "Daddy?" He turned back. "Yes?" "You could stay, if you want. Rosa was going to read to me before dinner. You could listen too." The offer was so simple, so small, but it hit Richard like a tidal wave. His daughter was inviting him into her world. After months, maybe years of distance between them, she was opening a door. "I'd like that," Richard said, his voice thick. "I'd like that very much." So he sat back down in the small desk chair while Rosa pulled up another chair beside Lily's wheelchair. She picked up a book from the side table, some story about a girl who could talk to animals, and began to read. Her voice was gentle and expressive, changing tones for different characters, making Lily smile at the funny parts. And Richard sat there, in his expensive suit that suddenly felt all wrong, and listened to a story he would have dismissed as childish just an hour ago. But now, with his daughter's occasional giggles and Rosa's warm voice filling the room, it felt like the most important thing in the world. Outside, the threatened storm finally broke, rain beginning to fall against the windows. But inside the room, something else was breaking too. The walls Richard had built around his heart, the distance he'd created to protect himself from pain, were starting to crack, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to rebuild them. After dinner that evening, Richard sat in his study waiting for Rosa. The room was exactly as he'd designed it, all dark wood and leather, built-in bookshelves lined with business books he'd never read, and a massive desk that cost more than most people's cars. It was supposed to project success and power, but tonight it just felt cold. He'd changed out of his suit into jeans and a sweater, something he rarely did before 9 at night. His laptop sat closed on the desk, emails piling up unread. For once, he didn't care. There was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," Richard called. Rosa entered, looking nervous. She'd changed too, into a simple cardigan over her work clothes. She stood just inside the doorway, hands folded in front of her like a student called to the principal's office. "Please sit," Richard said, gesturing to one of the chairs across from his desk. Rosa sat on the edge of the seat, back straight, clearly uncomfortable. Richard realized he was still behind his desk, and the setup felt all wrong. Too formal, too much like a boss about to fire an employee. He stood up and moved to the other chair beside her, trying to make this feel less like an interrogation. "I'm not going to fire you," he said, because that's clearly what she was thinking. "I want you to know that right away." Rosa's shoulders relaxed slightly, but she still looked wary. "Okay," she said quietly. Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to figure out where to start. "What I saw today," he began, "with Lily. The dancing, the music, her laughing like that." "How long has this been happening?" Rosa hesitated. "About a week and a half," she admitted. "I should have asked your permission first." "I know I should have. But she just seemed so sad all the time, and I thought maybe music might help. My nephew back home, he has similar challenges to Lily, and music always made him happy." "Your nephew?" Richard asked. Rosa nodded. "My sister's son, Diego, he's 10 now. He has cerebral palsy too. My sister, she doesn't have much money for fancy therapies or equipment, but she plays music for him, dances with him when he has the energy. It brings him joy. Simple joy, you know? I thought maybe it would work for Lily too." Richard sat back in his chair, processing this. Why didn't any of the other caregivers try something like this? Rosa chose her words carefully. "I think they were following your instructions very closely, sir. The schedule, the routines, they were doing exactly what you asked them to do. Professional care, medical care, all very important things, but," Richard prompted. "But sometimes children need more than schedules," Rosa said softly. "They need play. They need silliness. They need moments where they forget about being sick or different and just get to be kids." She paused, looking worried she'd said too much. "I'm sorry if that sounds like I'm criticizing." "I'm not. You've given Lily everything money can buy. The best equipment, the best doctors. Most children like her don't have a fraction of what she has." "But she wasn't happy," Richard said, the words heavy in the air. "No, sir, she wasn't." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the eaves, a steady rhythm against the window. "Tell me about the dancing," Richard said. "How did it start?" Rosa's face softened, the nervousness fading as she talked about Lily. "The first week I was here, I noticed she would look out the window a lot, watching the birds in the garden. So one day I asked her what she was thinking about. At first she didn't want to tell me, but I kept asking, gently. Finally she said she was watching the birds dance in the bird bath. Dance, that's the word she used." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "So I asked her if she liked dancing," Rosa continued. "And she got this look on her face, kind of sad, and she said she couldn't dance. I told her everyone can dance, it just looks different for different people. She didn't believe me. So I turned on some music on my phone, just a simple song, and I started swaying with her wheelchair, moving it gently to the rhythm, and she laughed. Just a little laugh, but it was there. And then?" Richard asked. "Then each day I did a little more. Moving the wheelchair became actually holding her, supporting her weight, letting her feel the movement in her body. The physical therapist has her do exercises which are good, important, but this is different. This is about joy, not treatment, about feeling alive and free, even if just for a few minutes. Richard thought about all the therapy sessions he'd paid for over the years, thousands of dollars, hundreds of hours, professional therapists with degrees and certifications working with Lily, helping her build strength and coordination. All necessary, all valuable. But had any of them ever made her laugh like that? Had any of them ever made her eyes light up with pure happiness? "Why Spanish songs?" he asked. Rosa smiled for the first time since entering the study. "Because they're happy. Latin music, it's full of life, you know? It makes you want to move. But also I've been teaching her some Spanish words. She's very smart, your daughter. She picks it up quickly. I thought it might be fun for her to learn another language in a way that isn't just studying. Through music, through play. Richard hadn't known any of this. He lived in the same house as his daughter, and he had no idea she was learning Spanish, no idea she was dancing every afternoon, no idea she was actually happy for parts of her day. What else don't I know?" he asked quietly. Rosa looked at him, really looked at him, and he could see her making a decision about how honest to be. "May I speak freely, sir?" "Please," Richard said. "I want you to." Rosa took a breath. "You have a beautiful daughter who is funny and smart and brave. She loves stories about animals. She's fascinated by how things work and asks me questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? How do planes fly? Where do butterflies come from? She has opinions about things, likes and dislikes. She prefers strawberries to apples. She thinks the color purple is magical. She wants a dog someday, even though she knows it would be complicated." Each fact hit Richard like a small stone. He didn't know any of these things. When was the last time he'd had an actual conversation with Lily about what she liked or wondered about? "She asks about you sometimes," Rosa continued, her voice gentle. "She wants to know what you do at work all day. If you have friends there. If your job is fun or boring. She wants to know about you, about your life. But she's afraid to ask you directly." "Afraid?" The word came out sharper than Richard intended. "Why would she be afraid of me?" Rosa met his eyes steadily. "Not afraid like you'll hurt her. Afraid of disappointing you. Afraid of being a burden. She hears things, Mr. Thornton. She heard her mother on the phone before she left saying she couldn't handle it anymore. Lily thinks she's the reason her mother left. She thinks she's too much trouble, too much work." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "That's not true," he said hoarsely. "Her mother left because Catherine couldn't handle the stress, but that wasn't Lily's fault. That was never Lily's fault. Does Lily know that?" Rosa asked simply. Richard realized with growing horror that he'd never actually talked to Lily about her mother leaving. He'd avoided the subject, thinking he was protecting her. Instead, he'd left an 8-year-old child to draw her own conclusions, and those conclusions had been devastating. "She thinks I work all the time because I'm avoiding her," Richard said slowly, understanding dawning. "She thinks I stay away because taking care of her is too hard." Rosa didn't confirm or deny it, but her silence was answer enough. Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden. The security lights illuminated the perfectly manicured lawn, the expensive landscaping. Everything looked beautiful and completely lifeless. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be what she needs." "Yes, you do," Rosa said firmly. He turned to look at her, and she was standing now too, her nervousness replaced with a quiet strength. "You're her father. That's what she needs. Not your money, not your big house, not the expensive therapies. She needs you to spend time with her. Talk to her. Listen to her. Play with her. Be present in her life, not just providing for her life." "I don't know how to play," Richard said, and it sounded pathetic even to his own ears. "I never learned. My own father was like me. Always working, always focused on success. I built this company from nothing, Rosa. I know how to code, how to negotiate, how to make deals worth millions. But playing? Being silly? That's not in my skill set." Rosa walked over to stand beside him at the window. "Then learn," she said simply. "Lily won't judge you for being awkward at first. Children are more forgiving than we give them credit for. They just want to know you care enough to try." They stood there for a moment, looking out at the garden. Then Rosa spoke again, her voice softer. "Can I tell you something my mother used to say?" "Please." She used to say that children don't need perfect parents. They need present parents. They need someone who shows up, who tries, who loves them even when they mess up. You don't have to be perfect at this, Mr. Thornton. You just have to be there. Richard felt tears threatening again, for the second time that day. He'd cried more in the past few hours than he had in the past 2 years. I want to be there, he said. I do. But I don't even know where to start. Rosa smiled. Start with tomorrow. Come home at a normal time. Have dinner with Lily. Ask her about her day. If she wants to show you something, look at it. Really look at it. If she wants to tell you a story, listen. Really listen. And maybe if she asks, you could stay for the dancing. I'd like that, Richard said. But I need your help. I need you to teach me how to connect with her. How to make her feel safe enough to be herself around me. I can do that, Rosa agreed. But you have to be patient with yourself. This won't change overnight. Trust takes time to build, especially when it's been broken. Richard nodded. Then a thought occurred to him. The schedule, he said. The one I gave you when you started. Throw it out. Rosa looked surprised. Sir? Not the medical stuff, Richard clarified. Keep track of medications and therapy appointments and all that. But the rest of it, the rigid timing of everything. Meals at exactly this time, activities at exactly that time. It's too much. It makes this house feel like a hospital. I want Lily to have more freedom, more spontaneity, more room for dancing and laughter and whatever else brings her joy. Are you sure? Rosa asked carefully. I've never been more sure of anything, Richard said. I hired you because you said you'd take care of people's hearts as well as their bodies. I need you to do that. Whatever you think is best for Lily, do it. You have my complete trust. Rosa's eyes got a bit misty. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. And stop calling me sir all the time, Richard added. My name is Richard. Use it, Rosa smiled. I'll try. Old habits. They talked for another hour, Rosa telling him stories about the past 3 weeks, about small moments he'd missed. How Lily had laughed at a squirrel stealing birdseed from the feeder. How she'd asked Rosa to teach her to cook someday, even though it would be challenging with her limited hand coordination. How she'd told Rosa that purple was magical, because it was the color of sunsets and flowers and mystery. With each story, Richard felt like he was meeting his daughter for the first time. He'd been living with a stranger, a quiet child who followed rules and went to appointments. But the real Lily, the one Rosa was describing, was vibrant and curious and full of life. She'd been there all along. He'd just been too blind to see her. Finally, Rosa stood to leave. I should get home, she said. It's getting late and I'm sure you have work to do. Actually, Richard said, I think the work can wait. For once in my life, I think it can wait. At the study door, Rosa paused and turned back. Mr. Thornton, Richard, I mean. Can I say one more thing? Of course, you're not a bad father. You're a father who's been lost, trying to help in the only way you knew how, but you found your way back today. That's what matters. The finding your way back. After she left, Richard sat alone in his study for a long time. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now. Not empty, just peaceful. Somewhere upstairs, his daughter was sleeping, hopefully dreaming happy dreams about dancing and purple sunsets. Richard picked up his phone and did something he never did. He emailed his entire executive team and told them he'd be taking Fridays off from now on. No meetings, no calls, no emails. Fridays were now his day with Lily. His assistant could figure out how to make the schedule work. That's what he paid her for. Then he opened his laptop and started researching. Not business strategies or market trends, but things like what 8-year-old girls liked, how to talk to children, activities for kids with limited mobility. He felt foolish Googling how to play with your child at 42 years old, but Rosa was right. If he didn't know how to do something, he could learn. He'd built a multi-million-dollar company through determination and hard work. Surely he could figure out how to be a better father with the same dedication. The clock in his study chimed midnight, and Richard finally closed his laptop. Tomorrow was Thursday, and he'd already decided he was working from home. He wanted to have breakfast with Lily, really have breakfast with her. Not just sitting at the same table while typing on his phone, but actually talking to her, looking at her, being present. It was a small step, but it was a start, and after years of running in the wrong direction, Richard was finally ready to start walking toward his daughter instead of away from her. As he turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he passed Lily's room. The door was slightly open, and he could see her sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and calm. He stood there for a moment, just watching her, this miracle of a person he'd helped create but barely knew. "I'm going to do better," he whispered into the darkness. "I promise you, Lily. I'm going to do better." And for the first time in a very long time, Richard actually believed he could keep a promise. Not because it would be easy, but because he'd finally found something more important than success, more valuable than money, more worth fighting for than any business deal. He'd found his daughter again. And this time, he wasn't going to let her slip away. The next morning, Richard woke up before his alarm. For years, he'd trained himself to survive on 5 hours of sleep, waking at 5:30 to hit the gym before heading to the office by 7. But today felt different. Today, he actually wanted to be awake. He showered and dressed in casual clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt instead of his usual suit. When he came downstairs at 7:15, Rosa was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She looked up in surprise when she saw him. "Good morning," Richard said. "Is Lily awake yet?" "Just getting up," Rosa replied, still looking puzzled. "I was about to help her get ready for the day. Mind if I help?" Richard asked. Rosa's face broke into a warm smile. "I think she'd like that very much." Together they went upstairs to Lily's room. She was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes sleepily. When she saw her father, she went very still, like she wasn't sure if she was still dreaming. "Morning, sweetheart," Richard said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "How'd you sleep?" Lily blinked at him. "Good," she said cautiously. "Why aren't you at work?" "I'm working from home today," Richard explained. "I thought maybe we could have breakfast together. A real breakfast where we actually talk to each other. Would you like that?" Lily's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" "Really," Richard confirmed. "Rosa tells me you've been learning Spanish. I'd love to hear some of what you've learned." A small smile tugged at the corner of Lily's mouth. "Okay," she said quietly. Rosa helped Lily with her morning routine while Richard watched, trying to learn the process. How Rosa talked to Lily through each step, giving her choices where possible, encouraging her to do what she could on her own while providing support where needed. It wasn't just caregiving, Richard realized. It was teaching independence while offering dignity. At breakfast, Richard sat across from Lily at the kitchen table, instead of at the head of the long dining room table where they usually ate on weekends. Rosa had made pancakes and Lily's had a smiley face drawn in strawberries. "So," Richard said, cutting his pancake into pieces, "tell me something about your week. What was the best part?" Lily thought about it, fork halfway to her mouth. "Tuesday," she finally said. "Rosa showed me how butterflies come from caterpillars. We watched a video about it. Did you know they turn into soup inside the cocoon before they become butterflies?" "Soup?" Richard repeated, genuinely interested. Lily nodded enthusiastically, and for the next 10 minutes she told him everything she'd learned about metamorphosis. Her words sometimes came out unclear, and she had to repeat herself a few times, but Richard listened patiently, asking questions, letting her teach him something. He realized this might be the longest actual conversation he'd had with his daughter in months. After breakfast, Richard made a phone call to his office. "I'm working from home today," he told his assistant Jennifer. "Clear my calendar." "But you have the presentation to the board," Jennifer protested, "and the meeting with the investors. Have David do the presentation. He knows the material. And reschedule the investors for next week." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you feeling okay? Should I send a doctor?" Richard almost laughed. His assistant thought he must be sick because he was taking a day off. "I'm fine, Jennifer. Better than fine, actually. I'm just spending time with my daughter." Another pause. "Oh, well, that's nice. I'll take care of everything." After he hung up, Richard found Rosa and Lily in the living room. Rosa was reading to Lily from one of her books. When Richard appeared in the doorway, they both looked up. "Can I join?" Richard asked. Lily nodded and Richard sat on the couch next to her wheelchair. Rosa continued reading, but Richard noticed how Lily kept glancing at him, like she was checking to make sure he was really there, that this wasn't a dream. When the chapter ended, Rosa closed the book. "Okay, Pequeña, it's almost time for your physical therapy appointment. Do I have to go?" Lily asked, making a face. "Yes," Rosa said gently but firmly. "Your body needs the exercise." Richard remembered what Rosa had said about the difference between therapy and dancing. Both were important, but for different reasons. What if I came with you? He offered. To the appointment, I mean. I've never actually seen one of your therapy sessions. Lily looked surprised. You want to come? I'd like to if that's okay with you. Okay, Lily agreed, and Richard could see the tiniest spark of pleasure in her eyes. The therapy clinic was 20 minutes away in a modern building designed specifically for children with disabilities. Richard had been here before, of course, to sign paperwork and write checks, but he'd never stayed for an actual session. He'd always had somewhere else to be, something more important to do, or so he'd thought. The therapist, a young woman named Keisha, greeted Lily warmly and seemed surprised but pleased to see Richard. Mr. Thornton, good to see you. Are you staying for the session today? If that's all right, Richard said. More than all right, Keisha smiled. Parents are always welcome. In fact, it's helpful when parents understand what we're working on so they can reinforce it at home. Richard had never thought about that. He'd always seen therapy as something separate from regular life, something that happened in this building with professionals, not something that connected to home. He watched as Keisha worked with Lily, guiding her through exercises designed to build strength and improve coordination. Some of it looked hard, and there were moments when Lily's face scrunched up with effort or frustration, but Keisha was patient and encouraging, celebrating small victories and making games out of the difficult parts. She's doing really well, Keisha told Richard during a water break. Her core strength has improved significantly over the past few months. Whatever you're doing at home, keep it up. Richard glanced at Rosa, who was sitting quietly in the corner. Whatever they were doing at home was all Rosa's doing, not his. But he didn't say that. Instead, he asked, "What can I do to help?" At home, I mean. Keisha's face lit up. She loved when parents asked that question. She explained exercises they could do together, ways to incorporate strengthening activities into daily life, how even simple things like reaching for objects or maintaining sitting balance while playing a game could be therapeutic. Richard took notes on his phone, something he usually did in business meetings but had never thought to do regarding his daughter's care. After therapy, they stopped for lunch at a small restaurant Lily liked. It was nothing fancy, just a family place with good sandwiches and a friendly staff who knew Lily by name. Richard realized they knew her because Rosa brought her here regularly. His daughter had a whole life he knew nothing about. The waitress knows your order, Richard observed as they settled at a table. Lily smiled shyly. I always get the grilled cheese. Rosa gets the soup. She lets me try a bite. What kind of soup? Richard asked. Tomato, Lily said. It's good. Do you want to try it too? It was such a small thing, sharing soup, but the offer felt significant. Lily was including him in her world, letting him into the small rituals that made up her days. I'd like that, Richard said. That afternoon, back at home, Rosa suggested they spend time in the garden. It was a beautiful day, sunny but not too hot. Richard had spent a fortune on landscaping, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd actually walked through the garden. Rosa pushed Lily's wheelchair along the smooth paths while Richard walked beside them. Lily pointed out her favorite flowers, told him about the birds she'd seen that week, showed him where a rabbit sometimes came to eat the clover on the lawn. You really notice everything out here, Richard said, genuinely impressed. I watch from my window a lot, Lily explained. Rosa says I'm a nature detective. They stopped by a fountain where goldfish swam in lazy circles. Lily loved